All right, guys. Today it's the 10th of November, 2020. It is Tuesday, so happy Tuesday and all that good stuff. And we're going to talk about what we consider the beginning of what is modern Japan, right? The Japan that you and I know, the Japan that gives us Godzilla and Nintendo. It's also the Japan that brings World War II to the United States and is the Japan that is today the third largest economy in the world and one of the most important countries in the world. All right. So for the do now, I know we have like a do now quiz and all that stuff, but it's a little kind of like an existential question I want you to think about, and I think it's an important one. And it's imagine that you've spent your whole life in your own town, right? You've never left, you've never met anyone from anywhere else, you've never met a foreigner, you've never visited a foreign place. You are stuck with the people in this hometown. How do you think this would affect the way that you grow up, how you develop, how you view other people, how you just see the world. I mean, you don't have to write anything down. I just want you guys to think about that, right? Because when you're very closed off like that, you develop a fear of the outside over time, right? That fear is reinforced. That fear is turned into possible anger or hatred or discriminatory ideas about other people. And it's a really important concept that happens a lot in world history, but more so in Japan, where, as you should know from reading Heart of a Samurai, that it was forbidden by law to leave Japan. So just keep that in mind, that the Japan that we are dealing with here, the Japanese people in which we're dealing with here, are fearful, are prejudiced against outsiders, and they themselves have no outside experiences other than their villages, their localities within Japan. All right, so we have a couple key terms. One of them is isolationism. Isolationism is a policy of one country cutting itself off from all others. The next one is concessions, and that is a thing that is granted, especially in response to a demand. So if I demand something from you, you give it to me, that's a concession. I'm giving you kind of something that you're asking for. The third is a consul. That's an official who is appointed by a government, and they kind of like represent their countries in other countries, right? So, like if you go to another country, you might visit a consulate in say Canada of the United States, and they represent America's interest, American citizen interest in Canada. And a consulate is the building in which that happens, right? And consuls work within a consulate. Some more key terms are minister. Minister is someone who is appointed by the government. They could be a head of a department. They could be a head of a government. Usually we call those people prime ministers. In Japan, regional areas are known as prefectures, kind of like states here in our country. And the prefectures are run by people known as prefects. Those are the kind of the regional governors, like our governor here in our state. When we talk about politics, we have or kind of branches of government. We have the executive branch, and that is one that is responsible for enforcing the law. And lastly, the legislative branch is the one responsible for creating those laws. A figurehead, more key terms, obviously, is a leader that doesn't have any real power. A prime minister, as I mentioned before, is the leader of an elected government. Authoritarian is a government that demands strict obedience from its citizens under the threat of punishment. Imperialism is an idea that this policy of a nation expanding its rule as kind of an empire over other countries, acquiring colonies, making itself larger and larger. And nationalism is this extreme patriotism some people feel for their country, but it's a dangerous one. It feels that their country is superior to other countries and that their country is kind of the best all the time, no matter what they do, and that their country is almost incapable of doing anything wrong. So those are your key terms. All right. Now, yesterday you had been reading about the Tokugawa era. Remember, this is a time when Japan becomes unified under a central government, under a series of local governments that involve daimyo and shogun and samurai. But during this time as well, Japan is quite isolationist. It is forbidden to leave the country under penalty of death. All right. But this is going to change when in 1853, an American naval commander, his name is Matthew Perry, that's him right there on the screen. He arrives in what today we call Tokyo Bay, but then Tokyo was called Edo, so it was Edo Bay. He is sent there with a mission from the United States government, from the president at the time, who was Millard Fillmore. And it's that Japanese sailors who found shipwrecked Americans were treating those Americans pretty poorly. And so Matthew Perry was sent there to negotiate better treatment and to establish better treatment for those shipwrecked sailors. There was a lot of Americans in the Pacific whaling. But he was also sent there to open up kind of a communications between these two countries, a relationship. Japan was one of the most powerful nations in the Pacific region of, the Eastern Pacific, and the United States was growing quite quickly in importance around the world. Now he kind of delivers this ultimatum, this, not, I shouldn't say ultimatum, but like, hey, here's what we want. But when he does so, he is arriving with large steam powered ships that are armed with cannons and are quite powerful and scary looking. And he goes, so I want you to just consider my request very nicely. But then he kind of like points over his shoulder and goes, don't forget I have those things behind me. Those big, ships with big guns. And I'm going to be back in 6 months to see what you say. And when he returns, the Japanese have decided to accept the Treaty of Kanagawa. Now, why they do is this. The Japan that he was sailing to featured bows and arrows, swords, and sailboats. He had cannons, guns, and steam-powered ships. And the Japanese quickly realized that their policy of isolationism had, cut them off technologically from the world, more than culturally, more than, socially. They were cut off, and they missed out on a lot of technological advancements like steam power, guns, large guns, cannons. And it's going to be a very rude wake-up call for the Japanese. This is how the Japanese drew, or not the Japanese, but this is how a Japanese book at the time drew Matthew Perry's boats. You can see the wheel here, right? The steam-powered wheel, the big anchor. Additionally, they still had sails on it. And you can see the American flag up here. You can see the portholes for the cannons right here as well. All right. And what does the Treaty of Kanagawa do? Now, first, let's stop. That drawing is how Matthew Perry was drawn in another Japanese history book at the time. Remember kind of the description that we read about how they viewed the originally in the 1500s, they viewed the Portuguese, ministers, the missionaries that are sent there. They described them quite unfavorably. Another kind of sensationalized view of Americans or Westerners, non-Japanese. All right, so the Treaty of Kanagawa, what does it do? The treaty returned shipwrecked sailors to the United States. It opened up 2 ports for United States merchants to go and trade within, and it established a U.S. consulate within Japan. In a little bit more detail, those are kind of like the big, like, what does it do, right? It also required the Japanese to send ministers to the United States as well, and it opened up later on, it opened up more ports in the United States. Over the next few years, following the Treaty of Kanagawa, Japan signed similar treaties with other European nations, opening up Japan further and further and ending Japanese isolationism. All right. It's during this time that 2 southern colonies, or territories, on the island of Honshu, the Satsuma and the Choshu territories, they formed what we know as the very originally named Satcho Alliance in 1863. And they had forced the shoguns, the leaders of Japan, to pressure the government to end relationships with the West. They were aiming to. They were attacked by Westerners. The Satcho Alliance then kind of turns around and says, hey, Shogun of Kyoto, the most powerful shogun of Japan, what more do you need to see? You need to cut off the relationship. The Westerners are bad for us. But the shogun refused. He understood that times were changing and Japan could no longer kind of be metaphorically and literally an island, right? You can't forever ignore the world around you. It just doesn't work. Not if you want to be of any importance in the world. The Satcho, in response to this refusal, want to fully restore the emperor and give them real power. And so they attack the Kyoto palace. They attack the shogun in January of 1868, and they try to replace the shogun. And they do. They defeat him. They burn down the palace. And this ends the shogun era, and this starts what we know as the Meiji Restoration. That's a really important term, the Meiji Restoration. If you think of Meiji, think of the letter M and think of modern. This is the modernization of Japan. Meiji, modernization. All right. The first emperor that is installed under the Meiji Restoration is right there on the left, and that is Emperor Mitsuhito. And he is the first emperor of this Meiji Restoration, and this restoration is Meiji is Japanese for enlightened, right? That they've learned, they've seen the world, they have to move on. Right. They moved the capital from Kyoto to Edo, later renamed Tokyo, which we all know is the capital of Japan. And this is as I keep going back to the modern Japan. All right, so what do? How do they make Japan modern? The Japanese government took land from the daimyos, from those regional rulers, and they made them governors of prefectures. So now, instead of kind of having their own gig, right, their own kind of like little kingdom, they are now like governors of states who are still responsible or to reporting to the emperor. It would be like, the president having governors report to him in our country. They spent 20 years studying different governments in the United States, different governments within Europe to figure out what kind of government they should have, what it should look like. They're trying to learn from the best examples. And while they're studying it, two political parties are developed. We've talked a lot about political parties over the past couple of days in our class and in country. But those two political parties are the liberals and the progressives. The progressives want control of the executive branch. They installed the emperor. And they would have had more power, but they had to share that power with the legislative branch, right? Kind of like so the emperor couldn't do all the things he wanted all the time. And ultimately, this emperor is going to rule over a government that is based off of the imperial German system, right? Germany at the time was still an emperor, still ruled by an emperor, and they decided that that the emperor should only be a figurehead. Like I said, doesn't really share, doesn't have any real power. But in fact, the prime minister was the real power, and he had ministers to run different parts of his government, kind of like how the president has different people to help run different offices about education or transportation or war in our country. We have those. We call them secretaries here. This emperor, underneath him, had a prime minister, but really that person underneath had all the power, and he had people helping him run it. Now, you could vote on the prime minister in Japan, but not really. The people were supposed to, like on paper, have a say, but they don't. Japan was becoming quite authoritarian. During the Meiji, During the Meiji Restoration, economics become an issue. Land was taxed and given to the peasants, and they were given a tax rate of 3%. But if the peasants had a bad harvest, they couldn't pay for that tax. And so what ended up happening is wealthy people would pay the tax buy the land, and then they made the peasant farmers pay rent. So they never really had an opportunity. So it was very quickly a place of haves and have-nots. The government, and this is really important, this is something Japan's government does today. They gave money to businesses. They provided trading information. They provided help and promotion of the businesses. The government got actively involved in creating, building, and protecting Japanese businesses. To this day, that is very much part of the Japanese philosophy of business. They are producing silk, tea, weapons, sake, which is rice wine, ships. These are the things that Japan is producing. And like I keep going back to, or like I mentioned, Japan's businesses and their government are tightly linked. That is still the truth today. All right, now this is the big one. How does it change its military, and how does it change its education system? Just like they adopted a German style of government, they adopted an American style of schooling, where you go to an elementary school, you go to a high school, you go to a secondary school, which are colleges and universities. The little bit different here is that they are taught in school loyalty to the emperor is maybe the most important thing you can learn, right? You are to sacrifice your life for the emperor, for the country, right? Think of it that way. They also begin to spend huge amounts of money on modernizing the military, and they make mandatory service in the military. So all men had to serve at least 3 years in the Japanese military. While the Meiji Restoration did kind of have a haves and have-nots, you could move your way through it. So there was social mobility, right? If you could pay for your land, if you could maybe acquire some more land, you could move up in society. That was not possible prior to the Meiji Restoration. Women were allowed to get an education. The country became much more Western. You could play baseball. Baseball is still a wildly important sport in Japan. It's probably the most important sport. It becomes much more Western. You see Western styles of clothes, men in suits, not so much traditional robes. Though that being said, commerce could still be exploited. In some cases, workers were forced to work 20 hours a day in coal mines. Japan, as a way to assert itself, remember, it's an island. And so by being an island, it is truly limited to how big it can be. You need to acquire more land. It's not like the United States. Like if we wanted to, I guess in theory, we could go take over Mexico or Canada, right? Japan doesn't have any neighbors like that. It doesn't connect to any other country but Japan because it's surrounded by the oceans. And so what they started to do is they gain more resources, they gain wealth. They start seizing neighbors. They seize the Korean Peninsula. They seize a series of islands known as the Ryukyu Islands, that which were originally controlled by China. And by 1894, China becomes quite worried, and they go to war. And Japan wins, and they gain the island of Taiwan, and they gave back an area we know as the Liaodong Peninsula, both of which are returned to China by Japan by later treaties. Pretty quickly after the war, too. It's during this time that as Japan is flexing its muscles, Russia, its very large neighbor, becomes quite worried. And in 1904, it starts a war. We call it the Russo-Japanese War, and it's a surprise. It takes just a year, and Japan is successful in defeating Russia. The world is shocked. They've just beaten the largest country on the planet on paper. Now, this is a country that only 40 years ago or 50 years ago was stunned by a man with a steam-powered boat. Japan gains two areas, half of what we call the Sakhalin Islands, a very long, large, thin island north of Japan. They still do control a chunk of it. And they also secure an area known as the Guangdong Peninsula. Right, so you can see here, you can see Sakhalin right here. You can see the areas, here's Korea right here. And then between 1904 and 1941, which is going to be very important, this dark brown all becomes part of Japan, right? So they control parts of China. Here's Taiwan. They control different parts. They are getting bigger. Specifically with the United States, the two countries decided that it would be best if they just respected one another. So Korea, which is under Japan's control, and the United States at first was like, maybe we shouldn't do that, Japan. And Japan goes, well, why do you have still the Philippines? And if we scroll back up here, the Philippines are right here. You can see Philippine Islands, USA, which we had taken from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War in 1898. And we go, all right, you got a point. So you leave ours alone, our claims alone, you leave our, just respect each other's claims and we have no problems. And so they do. In 1907, facing some pretty, racist backlash within the United States, Japan agrees to prohibit its citizens from emigrating to the United States under a gentleman's agreement. Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president, came to what we call a gentleman's agreement. It's not written down anywhere, but it was a handshake that the Americans wouldn't give the Japanese a hard time that were already here, but they couldn't keep coming to this country either. And that was just purely based out of racism. All right, so that's where we're going to leave it. And now my idea or my kind of closing, I do want you to think about this. The ways in which you thought isolation would impact you from the do now, right? Does that match what happened in Japan about being maybe racist or biased or scared or behind? Which probably a lot of you didn't consider being behind, but just give it a thought. All right, guys. Thanks. Have a great day.